14th and final chapter. Public thanksgiving to God for the deliverance of the city and diocese from the plague. 1578. It was now manifest throughout the city and diocese of Milan that God had been pleased at length to remove the scourge of pestilence, notwithstanding the apprehensions entertained by some timid people that a fresh outbreak might occur in the spring. The cardinal, who was confident that the prayers of the people had been heard, urged his conviction so forcibly upon the municipal authorities that he succeeded in driving away their fears and obtaining their consent to put an end to the regulations of quarantine. Here was a fresh opportunity to lead the minds of his flock heavenwards, and St. Charles did not fail to make use of it. We cannot but be struck with his watchfulness in seizing such occasions, and his energy in improving them to the glory of God and salvation of souls. In the first place, he published a little book, entitled Instructions to the People of the City and Diocese of Milan for the Christian Life in Every Class of Persons, intended to be a rule for all for their spiritual guidance, to help them in living holily in the world, teaching them to consider that the reign of sin ought to have passed away from among them with the pestilence, which had been sent as its scourge, and that it behooved them from henceforth to lead a new life of spirituality and perfection. This was accompanied by a pastoral letter, dwelling on the obligation which rested upon every one to show his thankfulness to God for extinguishing the plague, by trying to lead a life pleasing to him. He further required all the clergy and people to join in public acts of thanksgiving, including 3 processions and sermons, in the last of which he carried a sacred relic, followed by all the clergy, the magistrates, and the people, passing through every quarter and principal street, stopping at several places where altars had been erected, so that, although beginning at an early hour, they did not return to the cathedral till late in the day. On each of the 3 days of the processions, he desired that every priest should say a Mass of thanksgiving, and that in the evening on its return the Te Deum should be sung at the Ave in every collegiate, parochial, and regular church. On the return of the 3rd procession to the cathedral, he commenced the devotion of the 40 hours, after carrying the Blessed Sacrament round the church. During the whole time of these 40 hours the saint remained in the church, addressing the people from the pulpit of every hour. These processions were likewise observed in all parts of the diocese, as he had directed the rural deans to procure the attendance of clergy and people, that none might be wanting to this duty of rendering thanks to God for his mercies. He also printed a little book of devotions and prayers proper to the occasion. Finally, he brought the whole action to a close by another procession round the cathedral, in the same order as before, with clergy and people at each parish with its banner. In his sermon on one of these days, he spoke confidently of the deliverance of the city as being miraculous. And in a book which he published about this time, entitled Memoriale, he used the following words: "There is one thing, my children, of which we must make mention, which will make us appreciate more fully the magnitude of the mercies we have received at the hand of God. And it is this, that it was not to this city alone that this favor was granted of quenching the plague, but to the whole diocese, and that in so marked a manner, that it was at one and the same time that health was restored to both. Nearly 100 places of this diocese were infected, and at this moment there is not one spot which is not perfectly freed from it. Praised be the name of the Lord always and by all, but chiefly by us, who have tasted of his loving kindness." Again, in the 7th chapter of the 2nd part of the same work, he says, "Have always before you this great benefit which God has so miraculously worked for you, and never be at any time unmindful of his mercy." In another place, still speaking of their deliverance, he says, "This is no effect of our prudence, which indeed failed us at the very outset, and left us bewildered and lost. Nor is it due to the skill of physicians, who have not yet discovered so much as the origin of this malady, much less the means of counteracting it. Nor does it come of tender care for the sick, for they were at the first outbreak deserted by their nearest and dearest. No, my children, no, let us never fail to acknowledge this. It was the effect of God's mercy alone. It is He who has stricken us, and He who has healed our wounds, he who has scourged us, and he who has comforted us. He has taken the rod of discipline into his hand, and by his touch has changed it into a staff of support. In the same way, in another place, he brings forward reasons why this deliverance was delayed, and why God did not at once grant the prayer of his people. It was thus that, by deferring the time of restoration to health, God taught us day by day, more and more plainly, the vanity of the hopes which many placed in human efforts, taught us also that it was the work of his hand, and by this means pointed out to us the true way of restoration. He did not heal us all at once, that we might know that he required of us perfect conversion and amendment. The faith and confidence with which he made these assertions at a time when the rest of the population was hovering between fear and hope, doubtful whether the disease did not yet lurk among them, was taken as a proof that he could only have known the truth by revelation from God, and that this immunity had been granted by him out of regard to the merits of the saint, in answer to his tears, his prayers, and penances. St. Charles himself seemed never to think that he had returned praise and thanks enough to the divine majesty. Over and above the public acts which we have mentioned, he wrote letters to all the bishops of the province, exhorting them not to suffer God's mercy to be forgotten, but to stir up the people to show their gratitude in earnest. To this appeal they readily responded, and at the same time testified their thankfulness to him for having obtained this mercy for them. Among others, Niccolò Sfrondato, Bishop of Cremona, afterwards Cardinal and Pope, under the title of Gregory XIV, not content with congratulating him by letter, came to Milan on purpose to repeat them by word of mouth. While there he preached in the cathedral before the governor, senate, and magistrates upon the greatness of the mercy shown to them, edifying them by the lessons he taught, and gratifying them by so public a recognition of the merits of their beloved pastor. To render their gratitude still more lasting, the saint undertook another work, entailing upon him considerable labor, the publication of a book entitled A Remembrance for His Beloved People of the City and Diocese of Milan. It was intended to keep up their remembrance of the calamities and miseries of the time of pestilence, and of the mercy of God in delivering them from its horrors. I have called this book a work of great labor, because to write it he would not interrupt any of his other duties, but subtracted from his already scanty modicum of rest all the time that he required for its composition. This was not done without great violence to nature, and his secretary observed that need of sleep would overcome him from time to time, yet that he would soon rouse himself and take up the thread where he had dropped it, without requiring the repetition of what had gone before, as if he had kept his attention alive to the matter he was dictating, in a way which seemed quite miraculous. But other persons of sound judgment have thought that what the secretary took to be slumber was rather an abstraction of his mind in God, and a species of rapture, being guided to this conclusion by the loftiness of conception, lucidity of expression, and tone of spirituality which pervades the work, from which it seemed to them that he had been in those moments lost in contemplation, and that he afterwards dictated the ideas he then received from God. The moment the city of Milan was released from the restrictions of the quarantine, her former extensive relations of commerce were resumed on all sides, and a concourse of strangers as great as ever filled her streets. Much wonder was felt when, on taking a census of the victims, it was found that during the whole period of the plague, not more than 17,000 persons had died in the city, and 8,000 in the rest of the diocese, of which number 120 were ecclesiastics. Whereas, at the last visitation, in the year 1524, 50,000 had died, in 4 months, in Milan alone, and an incalculable number in the other towns and districts. In this the Milanese discovered another proof of the blessings they had derived from the labors and merits of their pastor. Here concludes the Plague of St. Charles.